All right. Hey, I'm so glad you're here this morning, and I'm going to share with you this morning. Usually, in the past at least, until this month, we've kind of spent our time talking about sort of what the Bible says about something that's going on in our world. Now, there's a little twist this month, and probably will never happen again, but this month we've been talking about a theory that I personally have. Now, I say that because we talk about what the Bible says about my theory, but the theory is mine and it's not necessarily from Scripture, so feel free to disagree with me or come up with a better theory. But I call it my 10 and 2 theory, and it's really just a way for me, and hopefully for you, to kind of imagine and sort of deal with where we are as a culture and as a world in 2019 in America. And the reason why I call it 10 and 2 theory is all of us were trained from the beginning when we learned how to drive. All of us were trained to drive at 10 and 2. And in fact, I know that's still true because for some reason, I keep seeing driver's education cars with the student driver sticker on them, and I always look and I always notice there's some terrified tiny teenager, because all teenagers look young to me because I'm older now, and with their hands at 10 and 2, and then there's the guy there with the laptop sort of staring at them as they drive. And so I know that we still learn to drive 10 and 2, but times have changed. And in fact, most of us would kind of scoff at that and go, hey, there are airbags now. Maybe you shouldn't even drive at 10 and 2 because it might blow your thumbs off if you're in an accident. But it's the way we were trained, and it's sort of our past, but we still believe in it. And if you have a teenager like I do, I'm going to teach her to drive 10 and 2, even though I've admitted every week, and I think my insurance agent goes here, so I'm afraid my insurance is going to get canceled, especially after I tell you a story today. But none of us actually probably drive 10 and 2 every day. I'm more of a 1 o'clock and eating something with the other hand guy myself. And quite frankly, technology has changed. I mean, cars are very, very different than even when I learned to drive. And it's interesting because it seems like there's sort of this dual thing that's going on. On one hand, cars are getting closer and closer to sort of driving themselves. But yet we always hear, hey, you should pay attention, and there's public service announcements, and it's a good idea. I'm not anti-paying attention by any means. But on the other hand, there's more and more things built into our cars to distract us, right? I mean, just like every time I drive a rental car, I just flip through the screens as I'm driving. It's a terrible thing to do, but you're just like, wow, you know that? That's amazing. There's who knew there was Tetris on here? This is amazing. So there's so many things to distract us, and everyone else is watching a different screen, and everyone has headphones on. And so it's an interesting sort of dichotomy that we all deal with, and the fact that we know we need to keep our eyes on the road and sort of hands at 10 and 2, yet everything's distracting us, yet we know the consequences. But there's a reason for it. And that's what I want to talk to you about this morning. There is a reason that we should drive 10 and 2, even though we sort of forget that as a nation and as a people. There's even that, because it's weird, because on one hand you go, well, if no one does it, if no one really drives 10 and 2, yet we were all taught that way, what's the point? Why do we even teach our kids to drive that way? Because they're not going to do it. Now, there is a reason, and it's probably not the reason you're thinking, because you probably think that we drive at 10 and 2, or we learn to drive at 10 and 2 so we can keep our eyes on the road and avoid accidents, right? That's the problem with that theory or that thought is, that there are actually no car accidents. And I'm not saying you choose to cross the line and hit that mailbox, it's not about that. Yes, we have accidents in the sense we don't choose to run into another car. We don't choose to crash. We don't choose to injure ourselves. And so we call them accidents, but they're really not accidents. And in fact, last week, I told you that, even though there's all of this new technology, even though there's lane assist, even though there's adaptive cruise, even though there's heads-up displays, and even though there are things in your car now that'll tell you when you're getting sleepy, hey, look at the road, pal, you're getting sleepy. All of these things, we're still crashing a tremendous amount of new cars. This picture that you're looking at is actually a Copart auction site. I was telling you last week, there's actually a thing online where you can buy newly wrecked new cars for parts or for repair. And there are tens of thousands of them, and this is one of their auction sites. And there's just a bajillion cars there that are wrecked, and they're all late models. So we're still wrecking cars. But I don't think there really are any car accidents, because when we have what we call a car accident, I would say to you this morning that if you think about it, if you really consider it, they're not accidents, they're just attempts to break the laws, and I mean the laws of physics, right? Like, there are certain laws in physics that we cannot break even when we drive our car. One of them, and there are many, but one of the first ones is the first law. Newton's first law, anybody who remembers high school physics, that every object in a state of uniform motion will remain in that state of motion unless an external force acts on it. Easier to say is the law of inertia, like everything sort of wants to tend to stay going unless it's stopped. That's why you have brakes on your car, because once you get your car up to speed, except for the drag coefficient of your tires. Now we're going to talk a little science. I'm going to go all science on you. And wind resistance from the air around the car, it would theoretically, in a vacuum, just keep going at the same speed if there were no drag on the axles. And that's fine. In fact, that's great. We like that because it makes fuel mileage go up. The problem is when we hit that tree or we hit that fire hydrant or we hit that other car, you and I tend to keep staying in motion, and that's why we have seatbelts and airbags and passive restraints, because as you know, like when the car stops, you tend to keep going. And so this law that you probably didn't think about this morning as you were driving, affects everything that happens to us in a car. It's the reason why when we hit someone, like our head hits the steering wheel or the airbag, and that's why we should wear seat belts, and that's why many, many things that affect us every day, like we don't think about it, but this law is in play every time we sort of start the car. And there's another, it's not a law, it's a principle, and this one's even more basic, and it's the Pauli exclusion principle, and you probably didn't think about this at all. That's Professor Wolfgang Pauli. That's only fun for one person in here, I'm sorry. But I had to do it. But here's the thing. The Pauli exclusion principle says something very simple. It basically says you can't put two objects in the same place at the same time, right? Like, it doesn't work out. You can't put two solid cars in the same spot, because they turn to liquid and they crunch up pretty bad. And you know this, because what do we call a near miss? Have you ever started to pull out and a car sped past you? Go, whoa, I'm glad I stopped. Or you almost hit someone, or I'm sounding like a terrible driver. I've had a few of those, And that what we call a near miss is when two solid objects almost occupy the same space at the same time, because it never goes well. Your car and my car, if one of them crosses the line and they decide to try to occupy the same space, bad things are going to happen. And then we'll get to experience Newton's first law of inertia. So it's like, even though you're not thinking of these things, and even though you probably never considered that, there are these laws, these principles that are just unbreakable. I said you attempt to break them when we have a car accident, because you really can't break them. No one has ever been like, hey, I totally shared the same space as another car, but nobody crashed. It was fun. I mean, that doesn't happen. And you can't say I crashed and I just sat there. I didn't have a seatbelt or anything. It was weird. Inertia didn't work that time. I didn't have an airbag, no seatbelt. It's just that time I broke the law of inertia. That never happens. And so if you think about it, 10 and 2, even though we think it's to protect us from accidents, this idea of keeping both hands on the steering wheel and sort of looking ahead and eyes on the road and no distractions really protects us from things we're not thinking about. It really protects us from these principles and these laws and these things that just are. You might not believe in the law, but you can't break the law of inertia. You can't break the Pauli exclusionary principle unless you get into quantum mechanics, and then truly it's probably the space of the atoms passing through each other, and that's a really long and nerdy discussion that I'm not prepared to have because I didn't pass that part of science, I don't think. But here's the thing, I want you to think about that this morning. Even though we all were taught to drive 10 and 2. And even though we're all 10 and 2 hypocrites probably, and even though we would teach our kids and yet we still probably wouldn't do it, if we've had a car accident, and I'm sure most of us had, we've experienced the fact that there are certain laws of physics, natural laws, if you will, that just can't be broken. And that brings me to the other 10 and 2. The other 10 and 2 that we're struggling with as a country is not the 10 and 2 where we put our hands on the wheel, but it's the 10 commandments and the 2 commandments. The 10 commandments of Moses, given to Moses by God on the mountain, on the stone tablets, and then the 2 commandments that Jesus sort of summed up all the 10 commandments and all the words of the prophets. Jesus was so brilliant. Jesus actually managed to sum up the entire Old Testament, basically all of the law found in the Old Testament in 2 commandments, and it breaks down like this. And I just want to refresh you if you're new today, or if you've forgotten since last week, or you've already memorized that, that's fine. But I just want to remind you that the 10 commandments are actually 4 commandments and then 6 commandments, and the first 4 are our relationship with God. They were all about how do we relate as humans to our Creator, and you shall have no other gods before me. You shall make no idols. So you don't worship anybody else, and then you don't worship anything else. And you shall not take the name of your Lord God in vain, and keep the Sabbath day holy. So these are based on how we respect God in our daily life. And so those 4 were summed up by Jesus by just saying, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. And this is the first and greatest commandment. So Jesus turned it into something seriously simple and seriously positive. He's like, all you would have to do, like if you truly loved God with all your heart and all your mind, these things would come naturally. And if you saw on the wall as you came in, and as Mitch said, like we say here, and we totally rip Jesus off, but we say love God, love people, and then the way you prove that you love God and love people is take action. But Jesus is the one who invented that idea. It's an amazing, it's just brilliant. And then the next 6 commandments were about how we relate to others. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. We don't lie. You shall not covet. You don't want what your neighbor have. You're happy when they get it. And so Jesus summed up all of these relationship rules, these commands that God gave for relationships. And he said a second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. And the entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these 2 commandments. And so once again, Jesus is brilliant. He summed it all up. He said, you wouldn't steal from your neighbor if you loved them. You don't steal from people you love. It's a sign you don't love them. And he goes on and on, like all you would have to do is really love people, and you wouldn't break any of these commandments. So Jesus summed it up beautifully. And so those are the 10 and 2 that we all struggle with, the 10 commandments of Moses given by God and the 10 commandments of Jesus. But the thing I'd like to talk to you about today is just like 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, it's really not about avoiding accidents. And we think it is, right? We think like these are really just sort of rules. And just like driving the car, we're like, we don't really have to keep both hands on 10 and 2 in order to be safe. Like as long as we get there safely and we don't hit anyone else, we're fine. Excuse me. And so most of us have that same attitude about the commandments. Like, yes, I don't want to, ruin my life by committing adultery and losing my family and most of my money and like my friends, laugh at me like, yeah, that's a crash. I don't want to be part of that. But as long as I didn't get caught, that would be fine. Or, hey, yeah, everybody lies. So this whole thing about not bearing false witness, no big deal as long as you don't have an accident. And so we sort of look at that in the same way of going, what you want to do is avoid the consequences, but the commandments are sort of like it'd be great if we all did it. Now here's the thing. I want to read you something Jesus said, because Jesus did not feel that way about the commandments. And it's interesting because if you're not from church, if you're not from a church world, if you're not even a Christian this morning, This is not going to totally surprise you. But if you're from church world, this is actually sort of more surprising to you because most of us get the idea in church at least if we were raised Protestant in the last 20 to 30 years, we get the idea like there was an Old Testament and God was sort of angry and he's a little grumpy. He's like an old man, but he moved to Florida and Jesus came along and Jesus is cool and he loves all of us. He loves the little children of the world, red and yellow, black and white, all are precious in his sight. So we don't have to worry as much about that because Jesus said just love everybody and don't judge anyone. But yet, we find again and again, Jesus points back to the commandments. And here's what he said. And I want you to know when he said this, because it's funny even where he said this, because this is in his sermon. We call them the Beatitudes, and it's actually so popular. Let me just read you some of the start of this sermon, and you'll recognize it if you're sort of from church world. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. So you've probably heard those. And that sounds like Jesus, doesn't it? It's like, man, that's powerful. Like, man, I'm going through suffering, and so I'm mourning, and my goodness, you don't know what I'm experiencing this morning. I love to hear that I will be comforted, and I've been wronged by others, and this says justice is coming. And so these are super encouraging and super positive and super like, oh, it's a brand new day. Forget that old law stuff. Forget those commandments. I mean, this is really different. And I think that's what Jesus knew people were thinking. Because right in the middle of that, the blessed are those who are persecuted because theirs is the kingdom of heaven, he stops. And he says this, he says, do not think, this is in the same chapter, check it out yourself. It's in Matthew 5. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches those commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Ooh, wow. That doesn't seem like it fits in there, does it? Especially when you understand that the Pharisees were sort of the professionally religious people who kept the commands but were still just awful people. And Jesus was always sort of calling them names and calling them out on their hypocrisy. But they were like, if you imagine in driving terms like they kept their hands at 10 and 2 all the time, but like their blinker was on and they were changing lanes in the wrong direction. And then they were out in the fast lane going slow. They were like horrible drivers who kept their hands on 10 and 2 because, oh my goodness, look at us. We're so, and so when you realize that Jesus is going, you got to be better at keeping the rules than even the professional rule keepers, it doesn't honestly make a lot of sense. Especially when he says, I haven't come to abolish the law, but fulfill them. And most of you would say, well, I thought that was the point. Because we say every week, and it's true, like law keeping, like commandment keeping will not make you a good person any more than 10 and 2 hands will make you a good driver. And last week I told you, but they put you in the right position to become one. Yes, they do. But if we could keep the commandments, if we could like sort of 10 and 2 and look ahead and never have an accident, then Jesus wouldn't have needed to come. Jesus came to save us from the fact that none of us actually keep our hands at 10 and 2 all the time. That our wrecking yards and our auction lots are filled with wreckage. You know, it's not like even with all the mechanical assistance and even all the technology, it's not like, you know what? I just realized something. There hasn't been a wreck in York County in like months. Like all of the tow trucks are out of business. No. We crash cars all the time. And then Jesus went on to say, I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not even the smallest letter. He's like, here's the thing. Not even one little part of it is going to change. I mean, basically what he was saying is sort of like the laws of physics, sort of like the first law, Newton's first law, or the Pauli exclusionary principle. He's like, the laws don't change because they can't change. Like, you cannot believe in the law of inertia, but it still affects you. Like, it just is. Like, you can really believe with all your heart that you can put two solid objects in the same space at the same time, and it ain't going to happen. And that's sort of what Jesus was saying. Now, this one part, on one hand, makes me feel great, because whoever practices these commands and teach them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So I said, I've been teaching this all month, so that's pretty cool. He did say that we should also practice them, which makes me feel like, I don't think that's working too well, because I have definitely not practiced all of the commandments either this week or any week. And it really bothers me when I read that. Like, the Pharisees were professionally good. Like, the Pharisees kept the law till it was ridiculous. And they were still bad people, because Jesus came to save bad people because they're only bad people. But in this beautiful, beautiful sermon called the Beatitudes, where he's like, blessed are you, and I'll take care of you, and justice is coming, and you'll be comforted if you're mourning, and he stops to say, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you'll certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. And you're like, oh, that is not up with people, Jesus. This is horrible. So how can Jesus fulfill, not break, because you can't break an unbreakable law. You can try all you want to break a law of physics. It's not going to happen. And Jesus said, these laws are not going to change, and they can't be changed, even though I'm here, but I'll fulfill them. Now, I can tell you, but I don't want to. I really can't. I can explain this, and I've been thinking all week, like, I don't want to explain this because it's embarrassing. I have to tell you, and I've never told this story it's a great preacher story. It's such a good preacher story. And I don't want to tell it because the story of my first car accident is so embarrassing. Like, you know how like you remember your stories from your past and you can sort of work your way around and make yourself the hero in some way? You know? Like, even if you did something dumb, you can make it. I can't do that. Like, there's nothing good about this story. It's a story, and I will tell you, like, if you see these shows and they go, no animals were harmed, this didn't harm animals, but lots of commandments were broken, and I broke the rule of 10 and 2. But my first car accident, I know this, and I have very bad memories, but I remember it because it happened very soon after I got my license. Like, I got my license on the day I turned 16. And I know it happened very soon afterwards because I was driving my dad's car, and I bought a car very soon after I turned 16 because I had a job when I was 15. And I know I borrowed my dad's car because I remember it was that, poop-colored 71 Oldsmobile Delta 88 Royale with the optional rust around the wheel wells. Because I know that because it had a bench seat, which plays into this. And I met a girl at school who liked Led Zeppelin. Now, to this day, I hate Led Zeppelin. I'm sorry if that disturbed you. I don't even like the new Led Zeppelin. I hate Led Zeppelin, okay? But I hate Led Zeppelin, but she was wearing a Led Zeppelin t-shirt, and she was tall and blonde, and I said, well, she thought I liked Led Zeppelin too, probably because I told her that. Just, it happens. Like, so anyway, we got to talking about Led Zeppelin because apparently she still thought I liked Led Zeppelin, and she mentioned that she wanted to go to the party on Friday night. Now, if you've ever listened to a Florida Georgia Line song, you will know the party I'm talking about because they are real, like if you think like, and you've listened to Bro Country and you go, that can't be real, that there's actually these big bonfires in Farmers Field, and like the guys that you think are cool in high school, but then you look back and you go, that was a 23-year-old loser who bought beer for teenagers. But that guy would have the party, and it would be in my hometown, in the field. There'd be a giant bonfire, and everybody'd bring their pickups and their cars, and it was just, it was a Florida Georgia Line song. Now, she wanted to go to the party, and I thought, well, I could, and she agreed to go with me, and that was the amazing thing. So I was working that Friday night. I remember that because that was my excuse to get out of the house. And I didn't even ask my parents if they would approve of a Florida-Georgia line approved drinking party in the middle of a field, because I knew what the answer would be. Now, that is one of the commandments, honor your father and your mother, but there is the exclusion unless they're really lame. And so my parents were really lame, and so I didn't tell them. So I just went to work like usual, and the good thing about me going to work, it's funny, my curfew, I remember, was 11:30 on Saturday night when I actually got to go out. But on Friday nights when I worked late, I could stay out till late and they would go to bed. And so I figured I had that all fixed, so I borrowed my dad's car and went to work and took the girl to the party, and I didn't even drink or anything. But on the way home, I still remember this, on the way home, and just from knowing when this happened, I had my license for maybe 2 months. I opened the door for her because I'm a gentleman, even at the Florida-Georgia line party. And she slid all the way in the bench seat. And I was like, hey, Mom, I like the way you move. That's Led Zeppelin, in case you know. But anyway, so she slid into the middle. I came around to the other side. Now, you should know this. Like, I know you're not supposed to lie. Unless it's to impress a girl. So I had a Led Zeppelin cassette yeah, I did. And I lied to my parents, and I took the night off work, which I shouldn't have done. And we were I was taking her home, and I hadn't been drinking, and it was almost impossible to have a car wreck. Because one thing you should know, and this is not actually a picture from Southeast Missouri, because I really couldn't find one. I was like, there has to be one. But everything that strikes me when I go home to where I grew up is how flat the land is there. Like, you can't even imagine that here. Like, if you think of a back road in Pennsylvania, it's all windy and curvy because it was made like a long time ago by horse and buggies sort of winding through. The land is completely flat there, where I grew up in Southeast Missouri. And it's really designed not like the way the horse would go. It's designed around farmers' field because it's all agriculture. So it's like a grid. Like, you will literally, I notice this every time we go home, like, you'll see a car's lights. You know, like, you'll see a car's light, and then it's like, seems like 5 minutes till you actually pass the car if it's late at night. I mean, because you can see for miles and miles and miles. And really, the only turns that ever happen on the roads is like occasionally there will be a 90-degree turn where it goes around a farmer's field, and it'll literally, they're just straight. It's like a grid. And so there was one turn on the way home that night. And no hands 10 and 2. I had like one hand maybe at 12. And they don't teach you how to make out with someone when you're in driver's ed while you drive. Like, I learned later, like, you got to keep one eye. But I didn't know that yet. And there was one turn. And all I know, and I'm serious, like, it's so embarrassing, like, all I know is there was a crash and like soybeans flying past the car. Thankfully, someone was behind us from the party, and they took the girl home, and they took me home. And I said the girl because this wasn't even my girlfriend. This was a girl. And then I had to go home, and, I'm late, and I wake Dad up and go, your car's in a field. And he goes, we'll deal with it tomorrow, which I thought was good, but I forgot my dad thinks tomorrow is still dark. So literally, by the time I got done laying there shaking, thinking of what was going to happen to me, he was like pounding on my door going, time to go. And so we took the tractor over there, and we got the car back. And he's like, this is not on your way home from work. And so he figured out what was going on. And so I knew I was in big trouble, and we got to looking, and there was a trail of transmission fluid that led into the field, and I realized, like, I drugged the pan out from under the transmission and just trashed that. And then Dad said something, and this is the part I'll never forget, and this is what makes it a good preacher story that I don't want to tell you. Is my dad knew those roads like the back of his hand because he went to work that way every day. He was a preacher, but he was an electrical engineer, and he had designed the lines there. So he knew that land, just lived there for years. And he said, there used to be a tree here. And there was a stump. The stump is the thing that tore the pan out from under his transmission. And now what my dad said, because he's a better preacher than I am, is, you know what, son? You were spared. Someone else hit that tree. They could have been killed or injured. I don't know what happened, but they hit that tree because there used to be a tree there, and sure enough, there was a stump that I hit. It was short. This isn't the picture of the stump. It was cut off really close to the ground. And you know what? The consequences of that were it's kind of ironic. My dad didn't really believe in grounding you to your room. Not that we had anything in our room that would have been enjoyable. Dad believed in labor. And so I worked, I think for 6 weeks probably, cutting down trees on our farm to pay for the transmission pan. And I had to explain to my girlfriend why I was grounded for a month and a half. And so basically, 2 girls very angry at me. That didn't go well. And my brothers and sisters were either laughing at me or preaching at me, depending on which one I was. You know who you are. But I never sort of got past that thing that my dad said. And I can't tell you this morning because I'm not as good a preacher as he is. Like I could tell you, like, my life was spared because someone else hit that. I don't know that. Like it could have been the farmer got tired of the thing and cut it down. But here's what I know. Like there were consequences, and there should have been. I was an idiot. I can't even think of a way to make myself the hero of that. Like I was just a jerk. But I didn't pay the ultimate consequence. Like the most that happened is like, oh, they laughed at me at school. They're like, Don's had his license 2 months. And like people saw me fly off into the bean field. It was so embarrassing. And my parents were mad, and my girlfriend was mad, and my brothers and sisters. But here's the thing, like I didn't get hurt. No one was injured. And so that's what it means, I think. And I want the band to come back up here. But when Jesus said, I came to fulfill the law, not to abolish the law. He said, man, there are just consequences to sin. Now, we like to call it accidents or mistakes or, ooh, that's my past or that's my bag. Here's the thing, though, gang. It's like the laws of physics. There are certain laws that can't be broken. The Bible says that the wages of sin, and I always talk about this verse because it doesn't say the punishment for sin, and we think it's punishment. We think the punishment, oh, God will punish you if you sin. Oh, no. That's not the point. The point is just like there's a law that I had learned in physics, but I attempted to disobey of inertia, like that you can't just drive, and all of a sudden make a right-hand turn at 50 miles an hour on a blacktop road. You'll fly off into a bean field. Like that's just the law. And 10 and 2 hands on the wheel would have definitely protected me in that situation, looking back. And 10 commandments and 2 commandments would have totally protected me. Like if I would have listened to my parents and if I wouldn't have lied to them and lied to everybody and if I would have honored them, like I would have never been at the party and I would have never, but here's the thing. Somebody took the tree down. And that's 100% true story. But I don't know what happened. Like my dad, he'd really close on this. He's good. He would tell you, man, someone gave their life so that you would, but I don't know that. But I do know this. Jesus paid the price for us. Not to take away the consequence of sin because they're going to happen, man. That's just part of life. That just is. But to take away the eternal death part if we choose to accept it. So that's why 10 and 2 exist, I believe. That's my theory, at least. And maybe we make a turn and we kind of go, oh, it seems like things are going bad, even though we have it so good. And we turn back to the 10 commandments and the 2 commandments. And I'm not talking about engraving them on walls or making kids at school learn them, but I'm like, maybe we'll turn back in that direction. It strikes me every time there's a school shooting or a church shooting or a synagogue shooting or a mosque shooting, we go, what is wrong? How can we fix people's mental health or take away guns or get more guns or whatever? And nobody says, what about not murdering? But I do know this. There are real consequences. There are real laws of nature, if you will, that God put into our world. And 10 and 2 really great ways to protect us from their consequences. But I am so thankful this morning. I am so thankful that in spite of that, in spite of the fact I've broken all of those, I shouldn't say, I say that every week and you're like, he murdered someone? No, not, okay. No adultery, no murdering. I'm pretty good on that. I got 8 of them. But here's the thing. Thankfully, someone else, just like in my story, took down the tree for you and I. And I want to pray with you. Dear Jesus, I am fortunate and glad to be here this morning. God, it's a it's a difficult thing to realize sort of the consequences and how foolish we can be as humans. And God, I fully admit that. And God, I'd love to sort of stand in front of these people and go, oh, 16-year-old Don Record was foolish, but I'm wise now, but I am not. And God, I know I'm filled with a church full of people who also have broken your laws and broken your commands and have experienced some of the consequences at least. But God, thank you for Jesus. Thank you that he took our ultimate punishment that we could not bear. And God, I pray that that would change things for us. And God, I pray that through that we would become a light that could change our culture in a positive way. In your name we pray. Amen.